Hi, it's Jennifer from Shabby Fabrics. We're back to do the next block together. This is called Grandmother's Cross. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I'm excited there'll be some new ideas here. Diagonal piecing, and that's going to be potentially new to you, so we'll be going over that in detail. Of course, the download is going to give you the measurements that you'll need for each of the fabrics. A lot of this will be stuff we've done before. Strip piecing to get our 4-patch units, so we won't go through that together. We went ahead and spun our seams, again, part of the beginner series. So we did 4 patches here, and then for our corners, we used our simple 7/8 inch ruler to cut 2 3 7/8 inch squares, once on the diagonal, so those look just like that. And then, of course, we did the strip piecing to make the 4 patch, but then I want to talk to you about this particular white triangle and bias. We've talked a little bit about bias in the past. Bias is the stretch, right? We know that when we're on length of grain and width of grain, we have less stretch than on bias. Bias is not a quilter's friend unless you want bias for a bias binding. Maybe you're going around a curve, or maybe you're looking for a specific look and therefore you cut your fabric on bias. For this reason, we are cutting a square that's 7 1/4 inches wide, bigger than our 6.5 inch ruler, which is fine. We'll go ahead and we'll just clean up this edge, and I'll be using the lines on my cutting mat this time because it exceeds the width of my ruler right here. My ruler is 6.5, so I'm going to go ahead. Let's just clean up that edge. I'm going to start somewhere, and 7 1/4 is what we're looking for. I'm going to remind you to add sizing to your fabric, especially this white fabric. Now that I have this at 7 1/4, or at clean edge, I'm going to just count over 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, and I love the 1/4 inch line on the Creative Grid ruler. It's dashed, it's very prominent, and I'm lining up that dashed line right along here. Double check my math and go ahead and give a cut. This line is now my new lineup line for down here, and once again I'm going to clean up that edge and measure over 7 1/4. This isn't anything you haven't seen before. Let's count over our 7. That would be 34 1/4. And we'll use that awesome 1/4 inch line on my Creative Grid ruler, lining it up, and we'll give a cut. Now this is cut twice. Before I cut this, I want to point out that right now, this is not bias, this would be bias. How we're going to cut this keeps the bias away from this edge. This edge will be straight of grain, and these will be the bias. We never want to have bias on the outside of our block if we can avoid that. And we can avoid that if we're being very careful about the way we cut our fabrics and the size we cut our fabrics to. So let's go ahead and get the spinning mat. We'll be cutting this twice, keeping in mind that this is now the bias here. Cut once, we're going to spin. I'm going to gently lift that off so I don't disturb my fabric. Just adjust that slightly. So we know that these are our bias edges right here, and this is straight of grain. That's going here. Nice straight of grain is here. See that? So we have thought through, and I want to encourage you as you're making quilts on your own, as you move forward, and you will. You might even come up with your own quilt designs. Think about that. Think about bias being up in the middle of the block if you have to have bias at all, and that you want straight of grain to be on the outside of that block. Because as you're sewing your quilt together, you don't want that edge to give at all. You want that to hold nice and square at 12 1/2 inches going into your quilt, or whatever your future quilt designs may be. All right, you get the idea. Now that we have all of our pieces, we went ahead and made those pieces ahead of time. Let's lay that out on our final design board, and then we can talk about the diagonal assembly that's necessary. As you can see, you can't sew it across this way. This is going to be assembled this way, and this may be the very first time you've ever done something like that. Nothing to it. We'll walk through it together. So let's go ahead and we'll just take a quick look at our block. It'll help us lay out quickly. That's up there, that's like this. We're going to use those four we just cut. Let's put those into position. And we have, this was our, as I said, that was a cut to 3 7/8 with our simple 7/8 inch ruler. Makes it so easy to find that number and cut that. There those are. And now we've double checked we lay it out, we look at our download, look at our picture. Does that look like that? Did we get to this stage accurately? Yes, we did. Now that the whole block is laid out, we'll be doing a diagonal assembly, because as you can see, you can't sew it horizontally like we've been doing all the other blocks up till now. With the exception of, we had a little bit of a diagonal going on with the green block, but here, as you can see, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to move the corners away. We're actually going to sew those on last. But I think you'll be able to see, especially as I separate that out. Simply put right sides together, 1/4 inch seam, press to the white, same, press to the white. We'll repeat that for this side. And for this section, you'll be pressing toward the middle. I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to do that. And when I come back, I'll show you how to finish assembling the center block and we'll add the corners. So I have my 3 diagonal sections put together. Again, let's put our corners out of view right now. Now, as we go ahead and assemble this, these intersections right there are really important, and this is where we'll come in with our pins. And not pinning, super bad idea. You definitely want to pin, and I'm going to go ahead and pin actually right through here. I want to emphasize that. In my earlier days of quilting, I would always pin out here. And because I don't sew over pins, as I'm approaching that, I pull the pin away. Well, that's the very thing I want to hold together. It kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And for that reason, when I am wanting that to come together just beautifully, I'm going to pin right along that seam line out here toward that point, and I'm going to leave that pin in. It's out here. I'm not going to sew over it. I'm going to do the same here. Let me have you watch me do that again. So I find it, I feel it, I can feel how it interlocks. Pin is coming from here, going straight down that seam, and I'm stopping short of my 1/4 inch. I'm going to pin right there anyway, just 'cause. This is one thing I hope you'll remember about quilting. I have been quilting for decades. I still learn from other quilters that have better habits than me, more experience than me. So if you are fortunate enough to be part of a sewing group, maybe you're on a quilt retreat, I encourage you to get up and walk around. Watch people do what they do, and you're going to learn stuff. I have learned so much whenever I go on a quilt retreat because I do get up. I am interested in what other people are doing. Maybe they're doing something I've never done before. And you know, everyone's excited to show you what they do and how they do it. Okay, so we've got this nicely pinned. Let's go ahead and sew our 1/4 inch seam allowance and see how we did on those intersections. Let's get that heating up. We're going to need that. All right. I love these pins. I used to think, oh, what's a pin? I would buy the cheapest pins I could find. Well, you know what I love about these pins, besides the fact that they're super sharp and they have a glass head, that's another thing. Some of the other pins I bought in the past have a plastic head, and when I would forget one, for example, it was in there, I didn't notice it, and I iron it, it completely melted the head of my pin. Part of it went on the iron and part of it went on the fabric, and I couldn't get that off the fabric and I had to start again. These are sharp, and I love that they don't disturb the fabric. They just kind of go in. They're very sharp, and I love the magnetic pin cushion because it keeps them all together. So if I do spill them, I just hover that over top of it, and it just seems to pick everything up. Now, this is the part of the block that we're looking at right here. All right. So in this instance, this seems to want to press to the outside. I'm going to go with that. Usually, if you're unsure, usually, there's exceptions to this. If you're unsure how to press, the block will usually tell it to you. When you lay it down on your pressing mat and you kind of begin to move that one side, open up that seam, it tends to go where it naturally should go. And if you're uncertain, go with that. And again, we'll repeat that here. I'll do that off camera. You don't need to see me do that again. I'll be sure I'm pinning very carefully, just like I showed you before, leaving those pins in and stopping short of the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Start here, pinning here first, and then follow up. I want to point out, and I don't think I pointed out on the other side, it's normal to have the triangle sticking beyond that, right? When you sew things together, if I was going to sew this to this, they line up perfectly. But when you sew things triangles, it is natural that they are going to be longer than the piece that you're being sewn to. So if that's an unusual sight picture, that's actually normal. So I'm going to go ahead and get that sewn on, and when I come back, we'll go ahead and put those corners on and finish up our block. So I've got this portion put together. I'll just trim off my dog ears here. Why'd they call them dog ears? That's a whole nother thing. Like, we talked about this. Who names all this stuff? I don't know. Fat quarter? That kind of makes sense. So we'll bring that back to our final design board, and now the corners go on. Again, you'll have a little bit of that triangle, just like we talked about, extending beyond both edges, both sides. And a great lineup is when you bring that fabric to this section, that point of this triangle should be running right down that seam. I know when that happens that I am in the right place. And go ahead at that point, and you can pin that a couple times and take that to the seam allowance or to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you'll simply repeat that, lining those up, lining those up. And I love having things to line up with versus, am I in the right? Because otherwise you could be slightly off. Lining that up one more time. Pin, sew your 1/4 inch seam allowances, and we went ahead and pressed to the outside. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make this block. We have just one more to go. You're doing great. I'll see you soon.